rates in Monday's budget. With me is Andrew Teacher, property expert from Blackstock Consulting, which has researched the impact of business rates on the high street. Andrew, thanks very much for coming in to talk to us this morning. Let me ask you, first of all, what do you make of what the Chancellor has announced in terms of the tax, leaving aside the other measures for the high street?
I mean, what they've announced today has got some good press coverage, so they've done a fantastic job PRing it, for starters. But I think when you scratch below the detail, what you're going to see is this is more of the same. And it's interesting because we looked at the actual impact of this a couple of years ago, and a very similar policy was announced by Ed Miliband when he was then leader of the opposition of the Labour Party. And what Mr Miliband proposed was a similar cut to business rates that would help small businesses. And at that time, actually, what was quite funny about this story at the time is that Labour was having a bit of a bust up with Boots over tax, and it turned out that Boots were set to be one of the main beneficiaries of this business rates cut, because obviously lots and lots of big chains and multiples, whether the Pretts, the HSBCs, occupy small buildings. And because business rates is charged by the building, not by the occupier, when you make a cut for so-called small businesses, you often end up helping lots of big businesses as well. So I think when you scratch below the surface of the announcement that's come out over the last day, what you're going to see is more fiddling around the edges and nothing that looks like a radical reshaping of business rates, which is what the previous Chancellor, George Osborne, promised not so long ago.
Promised, and there were consultations on, but nothing in the end came of it then, and has not so far. Do you think the Chancellor will come under pressure on Monday from other politicians to say, well, yeah, well, thank you very much for giving this kind of temporary relief, as it were, but you need to actually change the system? Because am I right in saying that, for instance, corporation tax is based on your profits, whereas here it's based on this definition of the value of a property, which is a kind of notional
absolute nonsense.
definition.
It's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense, because and in many cases business rates can be a tax on failure, because you pay rates even when the buildings are empty. It's nonsense. It's totally against the concept of how you raise tax. You pay more tax often if you've got an empty store, an empty property, an empty factory, and you're losing money paying, just shelling out for the costs of running it, and you've got to pay the tax. So I think, to answer your question, he should come under pressure, but he won't, because I think, firstly, lots of politicians don't really understand this. Secondly, business rates coins in £28 billion a year. It's a big wedge of cash, and it's not something that people want to risk, although they might not end up raising much of it over the next few years anyway. And I think, thirdly, businesses don't have a vote. And that's one of the things. This hasn't been as much of a public issue as it could be. And I recall talking with the BBC 10 years ago on a big campaign that we ran at the time at the British Property Federation around empty business rates, which is when Gordon Brown, as Prime Minister, introduced or took away the relief for empty buildings, and that caused a bit of a stink because people started knocking buildings down. It was only at that point, where we had Bomb Site Britain littered around us, to quote the headline from the Mail on Sunday, that people paid attention. I don't think we're at that point now, but where you've got government briefings talking about the toothless high street, I would say this is a rather toothless solution.
And finally, if you had a solution, what would it be?
I think we need to take a wholesale look at the rating system. We need to take a wholesale look at the planning system and really think about the sorts of communities that we want in terms of the financial structures and the physical structures. And the challenge is that obviously lots of the buildings that we have in high streets are owned by different people. So there's no singular interest, for example, in bunching them together and creating some sort of financial vehicle that can raise investment. And that's a challenge, because you then end up in court cases for years and years if councils want to CPO lots of property. But I think we need a reshaping of the rate system. We need a reshaping of planning to make it easier, quicker, and fundamentally cheaper for people to convert buildings. And then we need to look at some of the basics, such as parking and access via local transit, because again, where you're fining people to come and do a bit of shopping locally, it makes no sense. It's understandable for councils to need to raise money, but I think it comes down to how we budget. It comes down to the local budget cuts that local authorities have been receiving over the last 5-6 years, and ultimately it needs to be thought of strategically at a national level and not in the piecemeal system that we've had over the last few years.
Andrew Teacher from Blackstock Consulting, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right.